Please welcome to the stage Ann Neuberger, Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor of Cyber and Emerging Technologies at the White House, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Katrina Manson.
Thank you very much.
Great to be here.
Thanks for coming to the West Coast. And there's a lot going on in the realm of hacking. This administration, when it came in, faced a crisis with Colonial Pipeline in 2021. 3 years ago, the administration said this was unacceptable, this was a risk that maybe the US should have caught. And 3 years later, we've got the Change Healthcare hack. Who is dropping the ball? What is going wrong that a company this significant to a sector that is worth 20% of the US economy is being felled by ransomware in a way that now lives are being affected?
Well, that's why it's always so nice to come here to San Francisco, because you get direct questions, which are really the right questions to be asking. So let's take a step back for a moment and talk about what we're seeing. So first, software has made its way over the last decade into the critical services we all rely on, the water systems, the power systems, the pipelines, for a number of reasons. First, it made for more efficient operations, right? Companies could control remote infrastructure with more confidence. It was easier to build. We got more precision on that. And as we've put more and more Internet of Things devices, think about smart meters to help us, for example, consume energy in a more efficient way to help manage load on the grid. Software is all over our infrastructure in a way that wasn't there before. I've had the opportunity to work both cyber offense and defense, and it's a lot easier and a lot more fun to be on offense, right? Offense has to find one open door or window, one vulnerable system. Defense has got to guard every door or window. I'm just looking around here. You know, if there was a Secret Service agent, there are so many opportunities, right? So fundamentally, cyber defenders are already in a tough spot. And then finally, from a geopolitical perspective, post-Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's an increasingly permissive environment in Russia, both for financially driven attackers like ransomware. Our intelligence community assesses 70 to 80% of them are based physically in Russia, as well as for political hacktivists. And we've seen some of those attacks recently. So those three kind of set the stage for what is a tough problem. And I would add the final piece, which is critical infrastructure is owned and operated by private companies. And as such, those factors all play in. So what's been the approach, to your point, over the last 3 years? First...
And why has change happened?
Yes.
It's huge.
And that's what I want to talk about. What's been the approach? And then why does the change happen despite that? Which is really the right question to be asking. And the first piece is, the first part of the approach has been really working to lock our digital doors. For the last 10 years, there were no cybersecurity minimum mandates for those critical systems. So if you walk into any large building, there's probably a guard, there's probably a security system. The digital systems of pipelines, hospitals, water systems had no safety or cybersecurity, cyber safety requirements. Largely as a result of a number of things, primarily because legislation on the Hill regarding cybersecurity always had this tension between innovation and security, and generally the sense that by regulating cybersecurity, you would affect innovation has precluded that. Following Colonial Pipeline, the president said, I've got to be able to give Americans the confidence that their critical services can be safe. So we started essentially, it's called interpreting safety requirements to say each of these regulators have the authority to put in place minimum cybersecurity requirements. Frankly, the kinds of things we've been talking about for a decade, encrypting data.
So you were looking for authorities because Congress wouldn't pass the legislation?
We were finding ways to say, is there any way to do it within current law? And we found and cobbled together an approach sector by sector. In some cases, emergency authorities. That's how we did it for pipelines. In some cases, safety authorities. That's how we did it for rail. Because clearly, if TSA, for example, can say the physical rails have to be secure, The signal most definitely have an impact on safety. But that had never been done before. So over the last 3 years since Colonial, we've been working sector by sector with each regulator. First, educating, coaching, getting them the people. I mean, it's, as you can imagine, right? Top cyber thinkers don't necessarily think of going to TSA, don't necessarily think of going to EPA. So helping bring those communities together, the water community and the cyber community.
Water in particular didn't work. You landed up in court. Your efforts have very clearly, publicly failed, and the water sector is being hit now by Iran, by China, and by Russia. And now you've even got water tanks overflowing.
It's a great example. So the first line of the strategy, which was putting in place minimum mandates, it worked for pipelines, it worked for airports and airlines, and that we've been able to do it. It worked for rail, and shortly, hopefully, we'll be issuing a similar approach for hospitals following Change Healthcare. But in the case of water systems, when we released a rule setting minimum standards for water systems, 3 attorney generals sued, and we had to rescind the rule. So that gives a picture just of the complexity in the space. I want to talk about the 2 other parts of how we've been working to counter ransomware, because they all go together, and then and similarly talk about the complexity. The second piece is really a shift in strategy by our law enforcement community. The law enforcement community's approach used to be working with law enforcement partners around the world to try to bring people to justice. The reality is when many of the individuals are in a country where we don't have an effective law enforcement relationship, that had to change. So the FBI, the Department of Justice, and frankly, law enforcement partners around the world have worked to change and to start disrupting takedowns. The takedowns you saw of Lockbit, Hive, both the takedowns of infrastructure, trying to get the encryptor tools and build decryptors to make sure victims could decrypt. So that's been the second part of the strategy. And then the third has really been to build an international partnership, because everybody's hospitals, schools, and companies are affected. So as you know, this morning, I came from a meeting of the International Counter-Ransomware Initiative. The White House stood up this partnership, and 30 countries joined us when we started 2 years ago. It's now grown to 61 countries, large, small, from every continent. And today, we launched a platform where countries can share indicators of compromise, can actually collaborate to say, here's what we're seeing in a hospital. Has anybody else seen this? And the goal in all of this is to make it riskier, costlier, and harder for attackers. Because if one country has seen a particular malware strain and can say, we've seen that, here's the way you defend, here's the things you need to do, here's the individuals who are likely responsible, the community of countries fighting this, given defense is so much harder than offense, we hope can start to get the upper hand. But that's been the approach, that 3-part approach.
I know that there's a lot of store set by this prospect of more disruptions, more takedowns. Black Cat was one of the groups that was taken down, seized in the end of 2023. That's the same group that did Change Healthcare. And in the interim, all that Black Cat said was, now you can go after hospitals in the nuclear sector, they're free range. And now you've got Change Healthcare. So these policies are creating new problems, and you are now dealing with 1 in 3 Americans having lost maybe their personal health data. And I think with serious impacts also on patient care.
You're right. You know, I have a chart in my office that shows the disruptions over the last 2 or 3 years, and not just Americans. Americans obviously with partners. The Germans, the Netherlands are all strong partners on this work, and how they last for a limited period of time, right? Because you can take down the website, you can take down the infrastructure, you can try to recoup the money. At the end of the day, this is anytime anybody pays a ransom, it feeds the beast. And as you know, US companies, US entities paid $1.3 billion in ransom in 2023 alone. So is it any wonder that the problem continues and that those disruptions, while impactful, are impactful for a very short time? So they have to happen much more frequently. They have to be much broader. And we really have to think about how we focus on the money and turning off the money over time. And there's a lot of different approaches we've been thinking about, but that's a big part of having these attackers move on, we hope, from what's today a very profitable business.
So United Health paid the ransom. They paid $22 million, and they still don't know if the data is safe or not. Should they have paid?
I would say two things. The first question is, should that data have been unencrypted on that network in 2024? What do you all think? Should we have rules requiring that data to be encrypted? Because frankly, as you all know, even if the data is stolen and it's encrypted, AES 256, the most common encryption algorithm, cannot be broken even with today's most advanced commercial high-performance computers, right? So that's where the defense comes in. That's where the call to action for companies. And yes, as a government, we will be moving to start requiring that. But often when I talk to hospitals, because post-change, I've gone and I've talked to the American Hospital Association many times. We've done virtual calls with healthcare companies. And our first question is, what prevents you from encrypting data today? What prevents you from using MFA? Passwords are dead. We all know passwords are dead. We're human. Who can remember their password, right? That's the reason that passwords are. So that call to action to say...
What does the AHA say to you? Because they are opposing a rule that would mandate minimum cybersecurity requirements. They were opposing it in December last year. They're opposing it in April this year, after the hack, after patient care has been delayed. These are the people who are responsible for patients. What do they say to you? And you mentioned you're going to take a similar approach. Can you mandate a rule against their interest, even if Congress won't do it?
So first, we find with every conversation, that conversation comes closer together. So when we say, look at the cost of a Change Healthcare and the time to recovery, in our medical system, there were 20% fewer billings during the weeks of Change Healthcare. That means 20% fewer procedures, right? That could have been a postponed temporary procedure, but that point is a significant one. And much of that is preventable. That's not to say that every hack is preventable, but they can't be this easy. And we see malware strains reused again and again. So I think the conversation we have with them is, it's costing a fortune in mitigation and recovery, and a core part of patient safety is confidence that the system works. And as, particularly the healthcare system, as more and more tech is being used, frankly, as there's more and more promise with tech being used, that tech has got to be secure. So patients deserve that. And that's the argument we've been making, and that's the argument towards we look to putting in place minimum cybersecurity requirements for hospitals in the near term.
Near term, you're going to do something?
Yes. One of the things I've learned in government is never say the timeline, because it always takes longer than you thought.
So you'll put in a rule that does mandate minimum cybersecurity standards for hospitals?
For hospitals. We've been working closely with the relevant agencies and frankly with the sector to say, work with us on this. This is not one against the other. This is us working together to keep Americans safe.
But you will encounter a lot of resistance doing that.
I think it's on all of us to talk, and we've been doing rounds of that conversation. But I think one of the reasons, if you ask, why is it delayed? There has been resistance, right? Companies push back strongly. And quite frankly, the threat is here. The healthcare sector is, if not the most vulnerable, one of the two most vulnerable. They're here. And we try for a rule just to get them here. I will note as well, because we're here at the height, at the Center of American Innovation. At the same time we'll be rolling that out, we will be rolling out a free program of cybersecurity and training for the nation's 1,400 rural hospitals. Those are small hospitals in parts of America where if a hospital is locked in a ransomware attack, the next hospital is hours away. And a shout out again, we reached out to a number of technology companies and said, can you help us, right? You all have nonprofit programs. In our own country, there are hospitals that need the skill building, that need the more secure systems. And they've stepped up, and we'll be rolling that out together in the next few weeks. So a thank you to the tech community that not only is the source of innovation, but just is a source of good.
Thank you so much for coming here to discuss something in detail. I think it makes a tremendous difference to hear from you. One last question, which is that the SEC has effectively become a tool of the administration's policy in ways that is causing huge resistance and kickback. Do you approach, is it going to deliver the kind of cybersecurity outcomes that you want to see?
There was a very famous court case a number of years ago with a line that said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And what we've seen again and again is major cyber incidents that weren't made public. So the customers didn't know. And think about a tech company which had a major cyber incident. We're not sure if their code base was compromised. Shouldn't all their customers know about that so they can consider what risk they're at? So the transparency that the SEC's new requirement has put in place, which is that companies must disclose material incidents in a specific time frame. First, we hope it makes cybersecurity a CEO-level issue. We hope that CEOs start to ask their CISOs who need their support. Being a CISO is a tough job. Who ask, where are our key vulnerabilities? Can I see a recent pen test? And what do you need for us to address this? So goal number 1 was transparency for investors, customers. Goal number 2, as much, was getting the CEO to say, what does this company need to do to be safer in this really heightened threat environment?
We're at time, but I can't have you here in front of this audience and not ask you about Microsoft. So I'm going to. Tell us about the pointed conversations that you've been having with Brad Smith. Are they doing enough? Do you buy the new memo about security?
So here's what I'll say. Our economy and our national security rides on our digital infrastructure, right? The cloud is where we keep our corporate IP secrets. It's where we keep the nation's secrets. We have classified, unclassified clouds that have been a big part of improving government cybersecurity, moving off thousands of legacy systems and folks in that way. Those companies have an obligation to be leading the way in cybersecurity. And I think we really appreciate the steps Microsoft is taking to become a leader in this space. And that's because as we think about where we need to be as a country, trusting our digital infrastructure to be resistant to both criminals and adversarial countries is something every company and every government agency must be able to do. And we appreciate the big steps and the fact that the CEO of Microsoft has made that commitment, has tied compensation to this, because when you tie compensation, we know it's a company's priority to help us get to a more secure and safe environment.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Neuberger. Thank you.
Thank you.